own moderator, Julie Rovner, reported on those concerns that House Democrats expressed with the PPACA, that if the states didn't bother to create an exchange, their residents would have no way to benefit from the new law.
We're going to move into the Q&A with the Q&A from me first, and then we will open it to the audience. Before we get to that, since though I'm going to sort of step out of my moderator shoe just for a moment, since Michael was very kind to find that lovely picture of me and quote my story, I would point out that if people want more of the context of the story, it is available on the web, but I will also tell you that while that Texas letter did express concern about people not getting any benefits, they weren't talking about subsidies, and in fact, the paragraph immediately prior to that reads, this is talking to Tim Jones, this is about the House versus the Senate version of the exchanges, not so much whether subsidies would be available, but Ken Jones said, it seems to be a much more complicated process that has more room for failure, and frankly, I think a lot less accountability, he says, because if the state fails to do it, then the federal government is supposed to step in. But I think it's going to be difficult for the federal government to step in to say to a state, you failed, we're taking over. So that's actually the context in which I mentioned the Texas letter.
And I presume I will get a chance to respond since you're taking Nick's side.
I will. And you go ahead and respond.
Well, there's no other plausible reading of that letter or of your story, because the letter itself acknowledged that the federal government would step in and create an exchange in states that did not, and it categorically ruled out any benefit for residents of states that did not establish exchanges, even if the federal government stepped in. And this is exactly who you would expect to notice and complain about that provision of the PPACA. A very left-leaning member of Congress, Lloyd Doggett, in a very right-leaning state, Texas, the type of state that was least likely to implement a health insurance exchange. So you've denied that that's what the letter and your reporting of it means. Nick has taken issue with what that letter and what that letter means, but there's just no other interpretation of it. The letter categorically rules out the possibility of residents of non-cooperating states receiving any benefit from the PPACA's exchanges.
I'll chime in on the letter. So I encourage anyone listening to go back and read the letter. What's startling about the letter is that although the Texas Democrats expressed concern that Texas might impede the Affordable Care Act if Texas was given a lead role in potentially implementing it, what's striking about the letter is that there is not one word said about tax credits. Not one. They talk about impeding progress in the state, and in fact, Texas has done all sorts of things to impede the rollout of the Affordable Care Act, including declining to enforce its insurance provisions. But the absence of any mention of the loss of tax credits is the dog that didn't bark in the night. If Doggett really meant to raise concerns about tax credits, surely he would have mentioned it. Again, I encourage you to read the letter. It simply doesn't bear the interpretation that Michael would assign to it. And look, I respect the view that the statute says what the statute says, but the notion that this is what Congress actually meant to accomplish, the notion that there were people who harbored this subjective intent at the time, it is fiction. It is a fabrication. There's just nothing to support it.
Do we have questions lined up?
Your first question comes from Doug Pennington. Your line is now open.
Hi, thank you. This is Doug Pennington. I'm from Constitutional Accountability Center. I had a question for Mr. Cannon. I was just listening to the exchange you had with Julie a little bit earlier, and it reminded me that you've already once had to retract a claim that you made about now former Senator Baucus and what he believed about the availability of tax credits on federal exchanges. You did that last summer on your Forbes.com page. You made claims in your current King brief, or at least intimations, about what Senator Ben Nelson intended around tax credits. And as you know, he himself has flatly contradicted any such intimation in a letter that is cited in CAC's brief to the court. And now you have Ms. Rovner, the moderator of today's webinar, flatly contradicting what you claim her story says in your brief. And I know that for some reason you take your interpretation of her own work over hers, but I wonder if, with some reflection, you will decide that actually you should probably formally withdraw that citation in your brief in some communication to the U.S. Supreme Court. Will you do that?
Well, I want to thank one of my most persistent critics from the Constitutional Accountability Center for joining this webinar, asking the first question, and note that yes, I did retract the claim that we made about Max Baucus, not because I think that my interpretation was incorrect, but it's because I couldn't prove that it was the correct one. And I did it after someone said to me, "Wait, you have to look at it from this perspective as well." I considered that perspective. I realized that person was right, and I corrected my error. You forgot we also had another error in our briefs having to do with a bill introduced by Dick Durbin. We claimed it did something that it did not do, and I issued a retraction there. And if you can convince me that Julie's interpretation of her own story is not contradicted by her own story, then I'll be happy to make the change that you suggest. But no one has been able to do that, not even Julie herself, because both the docket letter and her story can only be interpreted in one way, and that is that that Congressman Doggett and his colleagues who co-signed that letter to Nancy Pelosi and Barack Obama warning about the exchange provisions of the PPACA clearly precluded the potential of residents of the state receiving any benefit from those exchange provisions if the state refused to establish the exchange itself, even if a federal fallback exchange were established in its place. So make the case, and I'll be happy to make that retraction if it's persuasive.
Well, I mean, the first thing I would do would be to refer back to what Professor Bagley said, and anybody who's listening in and watching this webinar today should really read the Doggett letter and then read pages 28 through 29 of your and Professor Adler's brief and figure out how in heaven's name those two things track with each other. And then read Ms. Rovner's piece in full context. Again, Professor Bagley and Ms. Rovner herself, pointed pieces of this out, and think how in heaven's name that piece from 2010 from Julie could possibly support in any way the assertion that you make. They just simply do not. And I think maybe on some reflection, you yourself will agree with that. And if you do, that you will take the action that I suggested.
So the question is, when am I finally going to agree with you? And my answer is when you finally make a persuasive case. I encourage everyone to reread the Doggett letter, Julie's article, and my brief with Jonathan Adler before the Supreme Court. But I think it's also important to recognize that while I think we're right on that issue, on the interpretation of that letter, this is a side show. What Congress, even if there were no legislative history supporting the plain meaning of the text, and even if the legislative history contradicted the plain meaning of the text, the plain meaning of the text is that these subsidies are available only, quote, through an exchange established by the state, and that prevails. If it's clear, which it is, then that is the law.